Welcome back. We now welcome to the stage Brandon McKoy of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
EconCon, it's great to see you all. My name is Brandon McKoy. I am fortunate to be the Vice President of State Partnerships at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And there I help support the State Parties Partnership, which is a network of state groups all across the country to research and advance progressive public policies, and in particular, progressive tax and budget policy. So of course, it's really an honor to be here, especially because I remember when EconCon 2020 was getting planned and I was all excited to attend. And then the world stopped and then the world changed. And so we had to make our conferences different. And it's just really wonderful to be here with all of you and have a convening in person with so many incredible, passionate, and brilliant people. And these are the types of conversations and ideas that we so desperately need these days. Now, I know my job is to introduce the incredible keynote speaker that we have this evening, and I will get to that quickly. But before I do, I would be remiss to not take a moment to recognize and reflect on the recent passing of Dr. William Spriggs, a stalwart figure, an incredible leader, and a genuinely kind and caring person who made the field of economics and our world far, far better for his efforts. His most recent position was chief economist at the AFL-CIO, and he was professor of economics at Howard University. He had a sterling career of remarkable and admirable accomplishments, including Assistant Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration, a position on the Joint Economic Committee in the 90s, and chair of the Department of Economics at Howard, where he also taught after being a professor at North Carolina A&T. And most importantly, Dr. Spriggs told the truth. He told the truth about the power of economics and its impact on Black communities who have been marginalized since before the dawning of the nation. He was clear-eyed and he was steadfast in his advocacy for a more proactive and imaginative economics that didn't merely tinker around the edges of minor curiosities, but tackled big and difficult and intractable problems. He insisted that we be explicit about racial disparities and that we vigorously advance equity to realize the promise of not just our country, but our world. And it is those values and vision that drive the tenets of this conference. It's why we are here, to ensure that we do all we can do to develop, advocate, and implement economic policies and principles that manifest a world that we don't just think is possible, but that we know is possible. And we saw it during the pandemic when government moved mountains to meet the moment in ways that helped those who needed it the most. And now that the public has glimpsed a more inclusive and resilient future, they are not exactly keen on returning to a pre-pandemic arrangement of policies that are benefiting corporations and unnecessary suffering and pain, where basic human needs cannot be met, where childcare cannot be secured, where better wages cannot be guaranteed, where discrimination and manipulation and trepidation are the status quo that we are all just expected to accept and abide. We are not going to go back to that. And so in memory and celebration of the life of Bill Spriggs, let us truly reflect and commit ourselves to the charge of advancing a bold, visionary, and inclusive economics that realizes the world we know is possible. And that requires learning more and thinking differently and creatively, and few figures have encompassed those qualities as well as our keynote speaker this evening. She has done the near impossible, y'all. She wrote a book on taxes, and it was popular. And her findings in the book resulted in the IRS acknowledging racial biases in their practices. And she's a tax lawyer, not an economist, she's a tax lawyer, right? So that's how it goes. Sometimes you need people with a different perspective to connect the dots in ways that we haven't fully appreciated or understood before. And she is tremendously accomplished in her own right, having served in the Department of Housing and Urban Development and holding several professorships at a variety of prestigious institutions before landing in her current position as the Martin D. Ginsburg Chair in Taxation and Professor of Law at Georgetown University. So it is my everlasting honor and privilege to introduce her. Please join me in welcoming to the stage this year's closing keynote, someone who has dedicated her life to justice through race and tax research, Professor Dorothy Brown.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for being in a room where I'm going to talk about tax, and it's not April. Okay, so tax policy is a racial justice issue. Tax policy is a racial justice issue. Tax policy is a racial justice issue. And I wrote a book called The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. And I've been toiling in this field for, I think, over 25 years. And if you had told me when I started that we would have an IRS commissioner who wrote a letter that said there's a racial disparity in audits, I would have said, I don't even know if I can dream that big. So what I discovered as I wrote on different issues in race and tax is race mattered. Wherever I looked, race mattered. But going back to something Brandon said, you need a different perspective. Well, I will just tell you, in the law professor world, I was not well received. I'm talking about race and tax to people who think race has nothing to do with tax. In fact, I was one of those people. When I went into tax law, I specifically went into tax law because I knew race had nothing to do with tax. I grew up in the South Bronx. Mother was a nurse, father was a plumber. I dealt with racism on the regular. And I'm like, I don't want to practice law in an area where I have to deal with racism. So let me pick an area of the law that has nothing to do with race. I know, tax law, because the only color that matters is green. Fast forward, I'm a law professor, and those of you who have professor friends know that we have some time, some free time. And one particular day, I read an article by a mentor that said, how do you know there isn't a race and tax issue if you don't look? And I just about fell off my chair. One, this was a mentor. He was brilliant. I always learned when I read from him. So if he says I should look, I'm going to look. I picked up the phone. I called him. I said, I'm going to look. And guess what I found? The IRS and the Treasury don't publish statistics by race. Okay, this is a problem. If I'm going to look at what potential disparities there are and there's no data, now I could have stopped, but you're not born and raised in the South Bronx to quit. So I just said, okay, I can't look at race tax data, but I can use my tax lenses to look at race data. And that's what I did. So I went out to different disciplines and I looked at social science research, and the Census Bureau puts out a ton of research based on race. So what I discovered was every time I looked, whether it was marriage, whether it was home ownership, whether it was work, whether it was paying for college, whether it was building a legacy for your children, the tax system advantages how white Americans engage in those activities and disadvantages how Black Americans do. And there's nothing in the Internal Revenue Code that says blacks pay more and whites pay less. But that's exactly what happened. So I'm presenting my research to law professors who say, oh, that can't be right. Or as one put it to me, Dorothy, everybody knows your work is irrelevant because blacks are poor and don't pay a lot in taxes, okay? So what I was facing in the tax law community was this acknowledgement that there might be a class issue, but there certainly wasn't a race issue because all the blacks are poor. So what I discovered by beating my head against the wall, the other part of being from the South Bronx is you are incredibly practical. So I decided I'm done with this wall. Let me go look at another wall. So I started talking to sociologists, and I started talking to AFM study scholars, and I started talking to Derek Hamilton, who I would say is the right kind of economist, but I digress. And I started talking to others who, when they heard me talk about race and tax, were like, give me more, and what about this? Look over here. So I realized I was in the wrong room. So it's important to be in the right room. So I will tell you, if you are ever in a room where someone's talking about taxes and racial equity isn't centered, get out. You're in the wrong room. Okay, so we have this research, or at least I produced this research, that I'm very grateful has led to other scholars picking up the charge. Because my goal from day one was, one, change the national conversation on tax policy so that you never thought about taxes and didn't also think about race. My other goal was to encourage others to follow behind me and to encourage others to lead the way in different areas. And I got my wish with respect to the Stanford Audit Disparity Study. So the co-authors will tell you the motivation for that was my book, The Whiteness of Wealth. And they asked the question, what does race have to do with it? And they actually found if we're talking about earned income tax credit taxpayers, they're 3 to 5 times more likely to be audited than non-Black EITC taxpayers. If you're Black, you're more likely to be audited. And what hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but is also in that study, is even if you go beyond the earned income tax credit, just being Black means you are statistically significantly more likely to be audited than if you're not Black. So when we talk about all this money that's about to come to the IRS for audits for those making more than $400,000, I'm always saying, check the race issue. Because the fact that the fact that there might be a disproportionate percentage of Black Americans who are poor, roughly 20-something percent, that leaves 80% that aren't, right? So we have Black Americans who are high income. We don't want to replicate this racial disparity. And yeah, we'll audit people who are making more than 400,000. They just happen to be disproportionately Black. Now that's wrong, but until you have the data, you don't know. So how did we get to this point where we could be auditing Black EITC taxpayers at 3 to 5 times the rate of non-Black EITC taxpayers? And this goes to a couple of articles I've written, and this research didn't make it into the book. The earned income tax credit was raced Black back in the mid-1990s when we created the child tax credit. It wasn't expanded to low-income families. And we had Republicans and some Democrats saying, well, we don't want to give this benefit to earned income tax credit recipients because they're on welfare. So what we had was our elected officials targeting hardworking, tax-paying, earned income tax credit claimants as welfare recipients. And what do we know the minute you say something's welfare? We have an image of who's getting it, and the image is Black people. So when we have this idea that it's really cheap to audit earned income tax credit claimants, it is, but it's also, we think they're all cheating because they're all on welfare and they're all Black. So this idea that in order for there to be racism built into the code, you have to have something in the code about race, we know that's not true. And for years, the IRS commissioner, the former IRS commissioners, basically said we can't possibly be discriminating on the basis of race because nothing in your tax return acknowledges race, and they hid behind it for years and years and years until the conversation got changed a couple years ago from a book I heard about called The Whiteness of Wealth. And as a result, I got invited to testify on Capitol Hill before the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Wyden became a champion, and he was the one who told the new IRS commissioner, within 60 days, I want to report on this Stanford racial equity study. And as a result, we're going to see progress. The IRS was no longer able to hide behind, you don't check a box for race on your tax return, so it can't be discriminatory. But what I've always said is, you don't check a box for race on your tax return, but we do know first name, we do know last name, we do know zip code. And if you know anything about social science research, race imputation is done on those 3 things. So what a surprise that it just so happens that Black people are overly audited, right? And if I hadn't written the book, and if the Stanford co-authors hadn't taken up the charge, we would still be fighting over this issue. So to me, the good news is we're no longer fighting over this issue, or let's put it this way, if you're in a room where we're talking about tax reform and we're not talking about racial equity, get out of the room. You're in the wrong room. So if you want to talk about progressive tax reform, you have to talk about race. And I know lots of progressive white Americans are very uncomfortable talking about race, and they think if we talk about race, we're going to lose the audience. But there are actually ways to talk about race. So what you need to do is get informed and get educated on how to talk about race, because you're never going to get a progressive tax policy without talking about race. So as uncomfortable as it might be, it'll be less uncomfortable when you get to the other side of it. And having the conversation now when people are much more primed for it is going to be so much easier than when I was having the conversation 10, 15, 20 years ago. So as I leave you, and I know there's going to be a panel discussion, I just want you to think about, or I would say, think about some ideas I have on what a progressive tax system would look like. First, it would have data annually reported by race. We cannot have a fair and just system if we don't know who's paying taxes by racial and ethnic and ethnicity. The second thing I would say, we should need to tax income from labor at the same rate as income from capital. Why on earth should I pay more in taxes when I work hard for my money than when my money is working for me and I'm asleep? There's something wrong with that picture, okay? And then I'd say my third idea is to keep the progressive tax system, and actually, this ability to pay is an important concept. It's the cornerstone of our progressive income tax. But when the richest Americans are paying less than the Amazon worker, something's wrong with this picture. And that goes to how income from capital and income from stock is taxed. So I will leave you to ponder these thoughts as you listen to this wonderful panel that's going to come up. I have to run because I have a meeting at Treasury in about 15 minutes. So thank you so much for your patience and your support, and keep making good trouble.